Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today is one of the occasional lessons I'm calling Christianity Q&A. And the question for today is, what is the Talmud? If you have read commentaries on the Bible, you have perhaps run across references or citations to the Talmud. But it is not always explained what this resource really is, where it came from, and why it is helpful in biblical studies. There are two bodies of Jewish writings that are referenced frequently as helpful context to scriptural studies. One of those is Second Temple literature. The Second Temple literature that is most often cited for biblical context was written from 100 BC up until about the days of Jesus. One of those most prominent works that I often reference is the book of 1 Enoch, a typical example of Second Temple literature. However, there is another body of literature, the Rabbinic literature, that begins about 100 AD, after the days of Christ, and stretches on for 100 to 150 years after that. Rabbinic literature, obviously post-biblical, and sometimes influenced by Christian thought, either incorporating it or reacting against it. However, it is still very close in time, relatively speaking, to the days of the first century. So I hope you find this lesson helpful as we answer the question, what is the Talmud and other rabbinic literature?
I wanted to give you a textbook definition on rabbinic literature. It comes from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. Rabbinic literature consists of the non-biblical writings of Rabbinic Judaism, primarily from AD 200 to 600. The rabbinic writings never became part of the biblical canon of Judaism, but they did become an authoritative part of mainstream Jewish tradition. Rabbinic literature includes the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Targums, among other works. I like to break things down by time and see the flow of things and when did things develop. Here's a timeline. The segments of the timeline at the bottom there are not even. So notice the first segment goes from 1400 BC up to 400 BC. So about 1,000 years in that first time segment. That is when the Old Testament canon was composed. It was redacted along the way. That is, later Jewish scholars took earlier Jewish writings and put them together with other Jewish writings older than they and edited them in some ways. For example, putting in a current to them name of a city for an older name of a city that was in the text that they inherited, but which nobody knew where it was anymore because it had changed names, and so the scholar would say, now that city is now called this when it was called that. Other kinds of edits that might have been made. But that canon closed, and those edits pretty much ended right about 400 BC. So the collection that we know as the Old Testament was a fairly fixed and unchanging written tradition starting around 400 BC. Then we come into another period. From 400 BC, which is roughly just a little time after the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, then there became the Second Temple literature. Some would even argue that Daniel, a canonical book, is an early example of what would be called Second Temple literature. The first temple, in other words, was Solomon's temple that he built per David's instructions. Then it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then, of course, Zerubbabel and Ezra helped reestablish temple worship. That was the Second Temple. So technically anything that was written after that temple was rebuilt would be Second Temple literature. That includes some biblical books, but also a lot of things that are not in our canon that got written between 400 BC and roughly 50 BC. We've talked in here about 1 Enoch as an extra biblical book that is important in understanding some background information to some things that we read about in the New Testament, not the least the book of Jude and 2 Peter. And 1 Enoch It is Second Temple literature. It is a perfect example of that literature. And then, of course, we have the life of Christ starting just before AD 1. Exactly how many years is a matter of some debate. And going into about 30 AD. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And the New Testament canon, the letters of Paul, the Gospels, the other letters of the New Testament, they started getting written down somewhere around 50 AD, between the end of the life of Christ and the time when the temple was destroyed, and going on to as late as around 90 AD. That's the dating of the book of Revelation is where that flexibility comes. Exactly how late do we date the book of Revelation? Some say it's as late as 90 AD. Somewhere in there, about 50 years. And notice just there how different the development of the Old Testament canon is from the development of the New Testament canon. For the Old Testament canon, it was a period of development that lasted 1,000 years. For the New Testament canon, it lasted 50. The difference is just quite dramatic in how the literature came to be collected. Another important date to remember is that in 135 AD, after that Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Jews were just officially and completely kicked out of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was populated purely by Romans, non-Jewish, Gentile Romans, and the Jews weren't allowed there. The temple had already been destroyed in 70 AD, but then the Jews weren't even allowed in the vicinity because of that rebellion that Bar Kokhba had led. Talk about unintended consequence, because that was pretty much the end of Jewish occupation in that city until much later. It's after that the Mishnah gets written down, sometime between 150 AD and 200 AD. Don't know exactly when. The Mishnah was written. There are rabbis. That's why it's called rabbinic literature, is because after the fall of the temple and after the Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem, the leaders were no longer priests. There was no temple to be a priest in. The definition of a priest would be someone who offered sacrifices at the temple. That was no longer a functional definition after the temple was destroyed. So the term rabbi became the common term for any leader amongst the Jewish people who was studied in Scripture and wise and respected. It would become a rabbi. Well, the Mishnah was an attempt by the Jews of AD 150 to 200 to try to capture the wisdom and knowledge about these rabbis and recapture, in some sense, what it was like to live when the temple did exist. Ephemera, things that just seem to be going away. People aren't thinking about them anymore because they all revolve around temple worship, and that's gone. So people are trying to grab hold of what knowledge and wisdom they can about what life is like with the temple and put it together into this document called the Mishnah. When the living memory is almost gone, and people get very focused on trying to get it written down on paper. I mean, that's one reason why we think that the New Testament canon and the Gospels were written, because the people in living memory were dying, and they wanted to get that story of Jesus written down so that we could carry it on, and as we have. The very first thing that follows the Mishnah is called the Tosefta. It's not as well known as even the Mishnah is, but it's a commentary on it. People commenting on what is in the Mishnah, trying to explain certain things. And then after that is the Palestinian Talmud. The Talmud is commentary on the Mishnah. How do we interpret what it is? If there are elements of it that seem conflicting, how do we work it out? The Palestinian Talmud, however, is not as critical in Jewish studies as the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud. If you're talking to any Jew or any biblical scholar and you say the Talmud says X, they mean the Babylonian Talmud. It's the only one that has retained historical significance and living, actually current significance amongst the Jewish community. The Palestinian Talmud is just a kind of a footnote to the Babylonian Talmud. I also want to mention those two other lines below because they are also rabbinic literature that comes into play in Christian studies at times. the midrashim. A midrash is a commentary, trying to take a biblical text and apply it to a certain situation. In our background and understanding, basically the Sermon on the Mount is a midrash of Jewish texts. And Jesus says, you've heard it said to love your neighbor but hate your enemy, but I tell you this. He's taking a previous teaching and he's interpreting it differently. Like when he says that, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I tell you, even if you call your brother a fool, you are guilty. So Jesus is taking a text and applying it in maybe surprising ways, maybe raising the bar, as we say in his Sermon on the Mount. He is taking a text and explaining it in a new way. This is a midrash. And so there are midrashim, that's the plural. It's dating from about mid-100s to after 400 of rabbinic literature. And one way we know it's rabbinic literature and not like Second Temple literature is that rabbinic literature is in Aramaic, whereas the Second Temple literature was often written in Hebrew, very familiar to biblical Hebrew, a kind of an offshoot of it, a later development of it. But in the rabbinic literature, it's Aramaic. That's the words of the text. Then there's the Targum or the Targumim. A Targum is a translation, but their translations are often very fluid. They are what we might sometimes call dynamic equivalents because they are translations that are trying to interpret the text as much as simply render it. Some Targums are fairly word for word from the original text, but others are highly interpretive. They're almost midrash in the form of a translation. But the thing about their translations is they were not very careful about footnoting where their commentary and interpretation starts and the text that they're copying ends. When you're reading these Targums, you have to just be always hyper alert because there are no clues in the text as to where they start doing some fanciful imagination sometimes with what the text says versus what was in the original they're translating from. The Masoretic text, which is the text that most of our Old Testaments are based on, most of the contents, and not the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of it. But the Masoretes were actually in that 100 to 200 year range, AD, after Christ. The earliest copies of Hebrew Old Testament texts were dated way after Jesus' life in 100 to 200 AD, the Masoretic text. But the Septuagint puts us back to 100 to 200 years before Christ. Septuagint is very important because it's older than the Masoretic text. So that's important. And then we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, which revealed some of these early 1st century BC and 1st century AD texts that the Jews had, and they don't always line up with the Masoretic text, not in every word. And sometimes they line up with the Septuagint text, but they're in Hebrew. Textual criticism is a fascinating study. Now, I have a translation of the Mishnah separate from the Talmud, but what came down to us from history is only the Talmud. It's the Mishnah and the commentary about the Mishnah all in one document. It takes some doing for the scholars to ferret out what part of it is the Mishnah that is from this earliest period, and from 100 to 200 AD, and what part of it is the commentary about the Mishnah that got added 200 years later in the Babylonian Talmud. There is a Jewish scholar named Jacob Neusner. He is deceased, but he, in his lifetime, was an influential Jewish scholar, and he came up with translations of the Mishnah and then of the Talmud, which is the Mishnah plus the additional commentary. And I thought his introduction to the Mishnah proper is just about one of the funniest things I've read from a scholarly source. As you think of most scholarly sources as very dry and erudite and practically always very invested in the document that they're about to describe for you. Neusner is invested in the document and sees it as important, But I have the first paragraph of his introduction to the Mishnah, and I want to read it. You can read along, it's on the screen. He says, falling into the hands of someone who has never seen this document before, the Mishnah must cause puzzlement. From the first line to the last, discourse takes up questions internal to a system that is never introduced. The Mishnah provides information without establishing context. It presents disputes about facts hardly urgent outside a circle of faceless disputants. Consequently, we start with the impression that we join a conversation already long underway about topics we can never grasp anyhow. Even though the language is our own, the substance is not. We shall feel as if we're in a transit lounge at a distant airport. We understand the words people say, but we are baffled by their meanings and concerns. Above all, by the urgency of their voices. Why are you telling me? Why must I know it? Who cares if I do not? I think that's just perfect. Why do I even care? Whether it's midnight or 2 hours later when I say the Shema, this is one of the first issues being addressed in the Talmud and in the Mishnah. It's like, this is just nitpicky. It's not important. But it was to somebody. And yet they introduce this conversation, as he says, with no introduction. It just starts and goes from there, and you're assumed to have understood why it was important to just have this conversation in the first place. This isn't the next paragraph, but shortly later he says this. If we turn to the contents of the document, we are helped not at all in determining the place of the Mishnah's origin, its purpose, the reasons for its anonymous and collective plane of discourse and monotonous tone of voice. For the Mishnah covers a carefully defined program of topics, but the Mishnah never tells us why one topic is introduced and another is omitted, or what the agglutination of these particular topics is meant to accomplish in the formation of a system or imaginative construction. Nor is there any predicting how a given topic will be treated, why a certain set of issues is explored in close detail and another set of possible issues ignored. Discourse on a theme begins and ends as if all things are self-evident, including, as I've said, the reason for beginning at one point and ending at another. I just love it when a scholar admits that the work that he has spent so much time on is practically useless and so difficult to approach. He does make a point about it and why it's important to study it and know it, but unlike the apparent authors themselves, he does not think it's self-evident. It is not self-evident why this would be important. He does say this. He says, the Mishnah was represented soon after it was compiled as the part of the whole Torah of Moses, our rabbi, which had been formulated and transmitted orally, so it bore the status of divine revelation right alongside the Pentateuch. Yet it is already entirely obvious that little in the actual contents of the document evoked the character or the moral authority of the written Torah of Moses. Indeed, since most of the authorities named in the Mishnah lived in the century and a half prior to the promulgation of the document, the claim that things said by men, known to the very framers of the document, in fact, derived from Moses at Sinai through a long chain of oral tradition, contradicted the well-known facts of the matter. So this claim presents a paradox, even on the surface. How can the Mishnah be deemed a book of religion, a program for consecration, a mode of sanctification? Why should Jews from the end of the 2nd century to our own day have deemed the study of the Mishnah to be a holy act, a deed of service to God through the study of an important constituent of God's Torah, God's will for Israel, the Jewish people? Is the question. But this is the claim, and Jews even today will say that the Mishnah and the Talmud, as commentary on it, are of equal importance as Moses' own Torah, as the Pentateuch itself. And whereas Moses wrote down the Pentateuch, nobody wrote this down. It was transmitted by oral tradition, verbally from one generation to the next, without being written down. All the way down to the 1st century and the 1st century after Jesus, where where it eventually got written down in the form of the Mishnah. I can't describe it better than he did, so I'm going to let his description stand of what the actual contents of the Mishnah is. The Mishnah is a 6-part code of descriptive rules formulated toward the end of the 2nd century AD by a small number of Jewish sages and put forth as the constitution of Judaism under the sponsorship of Judah the Patriarch, the head of the Jewish community of Palestine, at the end of that century. The Mishnah is important because it forms the foundation for the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds. It therefore stands alongside the Hebrew Bible as the holy book upon which the Judaism of the past 1900 years is constructed. In other words, you can't understand Judaism of the past 1900 years unless you have some appreciation for the Talmud and the Mishnah, because it's part and parcel of it. He says the 6 divisions are: 1, agricultural rules; 2, laws governing appointed seasons, that is, Sabbaths and festivals; 3, laws on the transfer of women and property, along with the women from one man, a father, to another, her husband; 4, the system of civil and criminal law, corresponding to what we would today should regard as a legal system; 5, laws for the conduct of the cult in the temple; and 6, laws on the preservation of cultic purity, both in the temple and under certain domestic circumstances, with special reference to the table and bed. Now, please don't get thrown off by the word cult. That is a technical term. It does not mean like what we normally would call a cult, being some perversion of religion. Cult means the practice of worship. How do you go about the practice of worship? The kinds of sacrifices you do, singing, songs, this sort of thing. The practice of your religion would be called your cult practices in a technical sense. It describes a practice of Judaism that was not actually what the Jews were doing at the time it was written down. That's the irony of it. Look how many times something regarding the temple practice, even the Sabbaths, the festivals, most of those involved sacrifices at the temple. Point number 5 is all about the conduct of the cult, the worship practices at the temple per se, and the laws and preservation of cultic purity at the temple and in these other places. So at least half, and actually in practice more like 2/3 of this Mishnah document, are about how to worship God in a temple. But we've already seen there is no temple when the Mishnah is written. It was destroyed nearly 100 years earlier, 200 years by the time it's actually finished. They can't even get into Jerusalem at this time, so they can't even partially practice it. This is the irony. The Jewish scholars who put this Mishnah together are describing a way of life and a practice of worship that they cannot possibly do. What is the point? Well, I think, as he said, it is a part of trying to capture that memory of how to worship at a temple in hope of a future time when that temple might get rebuilt. And then these things will be important again. So they are trying to hold on to a hope of a renewed temple practice even when they can't even do it. And they record truly nitpicky descriptions of how to do this or that little thing. You can't even do the big thing, let alone practice this little tiny thing regarding it. So that's part of the irony. So the Mishnah has been and is now memorized in the circle of all those who participate in the religion Judaism. Of greater weight, the 2 great documents formed around the Mishnah and so shaped as to serve in part as commentaries to the Mishnah, namely the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud, form the center of the curriculum of Judaism as a living religion. Self-evidently, scholars of the formative centuries of Christianity, down to the recognition of Christianity as a legal religion in the 4th century, will be glad to have access to a central document of the kind of Judaism taking shape at precisely the same time as the Christianity studied by them was coming into being. Jacob Neusner is a Jew, so he does not give credence to the 1st century origins of Christianity and the actual life, death, and resurrection of Christ. That's why he doesn't affirm it. He sees Christianity developing gradually over time. It's just that atheistic sort of point of view as well. But nevertheless, he does have a valid point that a lot of what we know as Christianity was sort of getting its feet under it Things like the Nicaea Creed and the Council and all of these things are happening at the very same time that the Mishnah is coming together. And so this is one reason it's important to biblical studies. It gives us into a mindset of what was important to people generally at the time. And also because they are grasping backwards in time to this time when the temple did exist and when things were going on at the temple, they are grasping back at the very moment in time when Jesus was alive at the temple doing his ministry. So some of the things that they are trying to grab hold of and keep in living memory, because it's dying, are the very kinds of activities and practices that would have been current in Judah and Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. That's why we can go to the Mishnah, and if it's addressing some topic of Jewish practice that has to do with temple worship, it's probably going to give us an idea, imperfect perhaps, of what it really was like in Jesus' day. Because that's the exact kind of institutional memory, we might say, that they're trying to keep. Just to give you a taste of what the Mishnah is really like, I quoted this from the very first section. This is how it starts. There is nothing before this. From what time may they recite the Shema in the evening? We don't even know who they are. There is no antecedent for that. That is the first sentence, is assuming that we know who they are, what the Shema is, and everything else that's going on. Where did the question come from? Who's asking the question? We don't have any information about that. But there is an answer. From the hour that the priests enter their homes to eat the heave offering until the end of the first watch, is the words of Rabbi Eleazar. But sages say until midnight. Rabban Gamaliel says, until the rise of dawn. His, that is Gamaliel's sons, returned from a banquet hall after midnight, and they said to him, we did not yet recite the Shema. And he said to them, if the dawn has not yet risen, you are obligated to recite the Shema. And this applies not only in this case, rather as regards all commandments which sages said may be performed until midnight. The obligation to perform them persists until the rise of dawn. And then he goes into an example, and then he says, if that's the case, why did sages say that these actions may be performed only until midnight? And he says, in order to protect man from sin. Gamaliel is a prominent figure in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and the question is there any correspondence between the biblical Gamaliel and this one? And it's debatable. Most people probably would say no. Why would that be important, this discussion as to whether the Shema has to be said before a particular time of night or before dawn? And I think it's very interesting that Jesus says this is the first commandment, and it is the first commandment to be discussed in the Mishnah, the Shema. Is there some correspondence there? That would be a matter of conversation, of debate, of discussion. But it is interesting, and one reason why the Mishnah can give us something to think about when it comes to how we are reading the New Testament. One thing that really kind of fascinated me as I was thinking about this is we know that in Jesus' day, the start of a day was sundown. That was the start of a new day. Sunrise and midnight didn't count at all. It was sundown. That was the end of the day and the marker. But obviously midnight became important by the time of the Mishnah was being written down because they were counting a new day as midnight. So if this is a new day, why do I have to do the stuff that was obligated the prior day? If it's after midnight, it's a new day. So is this something, do I have to do what I was required to do yesterday if now is today? It's just interesting that we see in the Mishnah a point where that discussion about when does one day start and when does one day end sort of becomes part of the conversation. Because if midnight's an important time of day to transition from one day to the next, then that becomes a marker for us to talk about. But if we're talking sundown to sundown, then midnight isn't an important time marker because it's not dividing anything. I should mention that most Jewish historians or Christian historians looking at this period of time say that these rabbis are the intellectual successors to the Pharisees. Like Sadducees or Essenes or other Jewish sects, they pretty much all died out after Bar Kokhba, but the Pharisees became the rabbis. Their tendency to nitpick, as we might say, carried over in full bore on this Mishnah and the Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, it's just basically commentary along with the Mishnah. You add the commentary to the Mishnah itself and you get the Talmud. And then some of those Targums are important. Paul mentions Jannes and Jambres opposing Moses in 2 Timothy 3:8. We would have no other corresponding references for those two guys if it weren't for one of these Targums, a Targum that's called Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, which dated 750 AD, might have been as early as 600. The dating of these Targums is a little flexible. But those two are mentioned in that Targum. And so we know that it was a common Jewish tradition, that those were the names of the magicians in Egypt who opposed Moses. We wouldn't know that except for the hint we get from Paul in his letter to Timothy and this Targum Pseudo-Jonathan from 750 AD. So that's why some of these early rabbinic writings are important for New Testament studies.
Thanks for joining me today as we stepped outside of Scripture proper to take a look at some of the wider context of ancient writings, the rabbinic literature, and particularly the Talmud. If you have any other questions about the Talmud or rabbinic literature or Second Temple literature, please post your question under the video or come over to the Facebook group, the Storm of Scripture Discussion Group. I look forward to continuing our studies in Scripture as we examine the treasures in the biblical text and its context.